I've produced 2 different videos recently in which I mentioned that maybe a certain specific group of people, in these cases, educated girls in sexist societies and vegans and vegetarians in meat-eating societies, they might be more depressed because they are accurately perceiving that the world they live in is fundamentally unfair or otherwise fucked. But today I read something that made me want to clarify that. While it's possible to get depressed or anxious because of accurately understanding something about the state of the world, it's not necessarily true that people with depression always accurately understand the state of the world more than people who aren't depressed. Let me explain. I was inspired to talk about this after reading this Vice article with the title, "Depressed People See the World More Realistically," which, let me be very clear, is completely untrue. The subhead, "and happy people just might be slightly delusional," is only not equally outright false thanks to the words "just might be slightly," but it is otherwise quite misleading. The article isn't terrible, but yikes, that headline. This is a concept known as depressive realism, which is an idea that was first introduced to me by Uncle Frank in Home Alone, who was skeptical that the family would make it to the plane on time.
Think positive, Frank.
Oh, you be positive, I'll be realistic.
Uncle Frank was wrong, considering that most of the family did in fact make it to their flight to Paris on time, but there have been actual studies that suggest the Uncle Franks in our lives aren't just big old downers, but they are accurately understanding the state of the world compared to their more positive peers. The Vice article details one of these, which comes from 1979, because that's when pretty much all of these studies come from. So in 1979, psychologists tested depressed versus non-depressed students by having them push a button and watching a light light up. The light had nothing to do with the button, but non-depressed students were more likely to believe that their actions were having some influence over the light. Depressed students were more likely to accurately guess that, well, nothing they did mattered. So that's fun. So in that paper, they cite a bunch of other papers from around that same time that altogether, they say, suggest that at times depressed people are sadder but wiser than non-depressed people. Those researchers had the right idea there. They didn't come out and say, this means depressed people are more realistic in general. They say, at times. They then go on to say, a crucial question is whether depression itself leads people to be realistic or whether realistic people are more vulnerable to depression than other people. That's an unfortunate way to put things because it ignores the other crucial question. Are depressed people only realistic when the reality is depressing? The Vice article correctly points out that these studies only show depressive people being accurate about depressive things. Nothing I do matters, so pushing this button has nothing to do with the light lighting up. Like if you did a study where we played a game and the only way to win was staying in bed all day, I bet I would do pretty great. Much better than non-depressed people. Here's an example of what happens when you do the opposite of that. Psychologist Richard Wisemans set up an experiment that would reward positive people. He invited people to come into his lab for a test, and he left money laying out in the open on the ground outside. People who thought of themselves as lucky were more likely to notice the money and pick it up. People who were negative, who thought of themselves as like unfortunate walking disasters, tended to miss it. Same reality, different perspectives, different results. And it's the positive people who saw reality for what it was. The Vice article discusses the aspect of death as another example of how depressive people may just be seeing reality for what it is. Death is terrifying and inevitable, and so the natural state of the rational mind must be depression. But that is absolutely wrong, and I'm shocked that an otherwise pretty balanced article, aside from that headline, ignores the many fascinating aspects of how we think about death. This is something I have personally been very interested in for a long time, at least since I was 17 and realized Oh, I'm an atheist. Because I had to confront the fact that I'm not going to live forever with all of my loved ones in a cloud playing a harp, as I had previously spent 17 years believing. I'm going to cease to exist. I'm going to be forgotten, just like everyone I've ever loved. That was a very depressing idea to me at the time, and I spent a good 10 years being kept up at night just thinking about it. It doesn't keep me up at night anymore, and several things contributed to that change. One, I have talked about before quite openly, which is antidepressants. I went on them back during the elevator gate thing when I was getting tons of death threats and rape threats from men's rights activists. I went to my doctor at the time because I was horribly depressed and full of anxiety all the time that I wasn't depressed. So he prescribed me escitalopram. I was shocked to find that that drug also fixed those sleepless nights that I spent thinking about my impending death, which I just had assumed was the natural human condition. Like, once you realize we're all going to die one day, you just spend your whole life thinking about it and being depressed about it. But no, once I went on the crazy pills, I would still think about it. It would pop into my head. I'm going to die one day. But then I would also think, yeah, but there's nothing I can do about that. It's inevitable. So why keep thinking about it? Because you see, yes, knowing I was going to die one day is a realistic but also depressing thought. But the other aspect of that objective reality is that there's nothing I can do about it. So there's no point to continually worrying about it. That is also an aspect of reality, but one that my anxiety damaged brain could not even comprehend. Another thing that helped me was realizing that other cultures with different religious beliefs than mine had a more realistic understanding of life and death that was also therefore less depressing. Many Jewish and Buddhist people grow up knowing that there is no life after death. And by growing up with that understanding, there's no depressive crash 17 years later. This is just a fact of life that has always existed, so why worry about it? Finally, I found comfort in a scientific understanding of what happens when we die. The me that is me isn't really me at all. I'm a collection of cells that are currently organized in such a way to temporarily have some sense of self, which grants me the ability to learn more about the universe, which by definition is also me. Philosophers and scientists like Carl Sagan have said this before. We are a way for the universe to know itself. We are star stuff. Or to quote the great philosopher Chidi Anaganye, picture a wave in the ocean. You can see it, you can measure it, its height, the way the sunlight refracts as it passes through, and it's there. You can see it and you know what it is. It's a wave. And then it crashes on the shore and it's gone. But the water is still there. The wave was just a different way for the water to be for a little while. That's one conception of death for a Buddhist. The wave returns to the ocean where it came from and where it's meant to be. That's no less realistic than I'm going to die one day and that sucks, right? One more anecdote to put this into perspective. When I lived in Boston before I was on magical brain drugs, before I even knew that I had severe depression and anxiety, I was riding my bike to work through heavy Boston traffic. If you've never been in Boston traffic before, let me just tell you that as a cyclist, I've been hit by cars 4 times in Boston and never in any other city I've lived in. So it's a little bit stressful, you know. And I decided that day to cut through Boston Public Garden, which was technically illegal for a bike, but you know, I had 0 chance of being hit by a cab driver. And in the early morning, it was usually pretty deserted. And as I was cutting through the gardens, I saw this woman jogging towards me, pushing one of those like $400 baby carriages and wearing like all the expensive, trendy jogging clothes. And I remember thinking like, ugh, this fucking rich asshole breeder. Like, I was just full of hate for this random woman because she could afford nice things and live in an expensive part of town and have a baby and exercise, I guess. But as she jogged closer, I noticed that, inside the stroller, there was a baby sleeping, but also on the back of the stroller was this little girl who was maybe like 3 or 4 years old. And she looked like she was just having the time of her life. A huge smile on her face, her hair blowing in the wind, probably felt like she was going 100 miles an hour. And seeing her made me smile. And then it made me kind of stop and go back and really pay attention to what I had been thinking before. Because those earlier thoughts had just been like this background, a sort of knee-jerk anger and resentment. But when I went back and examined them, I was like, why was I so angry? Like, really, why was I angry? It wasn't about the woman. It was about the traffic, and it was about my own anxiety and my depression. My screwy brain didn't make me see the reality, which was, sure, a woman who looked like she was rich and fulfilled while I was neither was running down the street. But the real reality was that it was a beautiful day. I was on my bike. I was living in a beautiful city with a good job where I was well paid. And that woman had nothing to do with me. That happened a good 15 years ago. And I still think of that woman and that little girl. And they're a reminder that sometimes when I'm in a bad mood, it might be because I'm paying attention to the wrong things. It's all reality, but we get to pick and choose what we focus on. Or at least we can pick and choose when our brains are normal. Sometimes our brains are riddled with anxiety and depression, and they choose what to focus on. So when I can, now that I'm medicated, I can stop and examine my mood and figure out what's actually upsetting me. And then fix it, which might mean adjusting my brain meds. It might mean remembering to take my brain meds. Or it might mean shutting my laptop and going for a walk, touching grass. But the reality of living with severe depression and anxiety is that for the rest of my life, I will need to do this. I'll need to recalibrate and make sure that I'm not just viewing the world through shit-colored glasses. So no, Vice headline writers, depressed people do not see the world more realistically. Depression is a fucking liar. And while some happy people are delusional, I'm sure, there are plenty of other happy people who are happy because their brains work correctly, or because they're working really hard to make up for the fact that their brains kind of suck sometimes. And good for them.